Well, good morning and welcome to a very autumn day here in Cambridge. Now, today we're going to talk about heat pumps. And I know a lot of you have already had your heat pumps installed, but there's an awful lot of people who reach out to me with a pretty common set of questions. So today we're going to take a look at the heat pump. We're going to answer your top 5 questions. In fact, we might also do a couple of bonus ones, so stick around to the end. Let's start with location. Now, as you can see, I'm fortunate enough that my heat pump is located at the side of my house. We live in a detached property. It's a standard 3-bedroom house built in the late 90s, but we have a couple of meters of space at the side before our boundary fence and a couple of meters at the other side as well. Now, I understand not everybody can do that, especially if you live in a terraced house. So it's important to think about where would your heat pump go. Now, in this case, as you can see, we've just put it around the side of the house. All of the pipe work is on the side of the house, so it's out of the way. You don't really see it day to day unless you're coming down the side of the house. Occasionally we hang washing out here, but location is important because this is going to be there for the next 20 years minimum. And if you're going to be living in that house and you don't like where it's located, you're going to be the one that's living with it for the next 20 years. Now, something else to consider. Put my cup of tea down. Underneath your heat pump, you will need a soakaway. So this gravel bed you can see here allows condensate from the heat pump to drip down into the stones and then disperse into the soakaway. If you do not have space to have a soakaway underneath your heat pump, you will need access to a drain. Now, the heat pump can drain out of the back through a hose and into an existing drain. But if you do not have either, you're going to have to think about how are you going to get the condensate from this device into a drain. Now, the reason for that is in the winter, the radiator on the back of the heat pump here will freeze up. And as you can see in the short video that I'll put on the screen now, the defrost cycle of your heat pump will melt all that ice away. And all of that water has to go somewhere. And the last thing you want is the water pooling in front of your heat pump and then freezing on the ground, because then it becomes a slip hazard. So just consider the drainage of the system where you're thinking about putting it. Now, something else to consider. This is a Daikin heat pump. This uses R32 as a coolant. We can see down here on the label, it's an R32 heat pump. R32 is a relatively inert gas. There's not actually that much in it, but there are no problems with R32. If you're having an R290 heat pump, so that would include things like the Octopus Cozy range of heat pumps, R290 allows for much higher flow temperatures within the heat pump. But the downside of R290 is it is potentially explosive. That's because R290 is basically a derivative of propane. Now, before we all start worrying about heat pumps blowing up, there is a tiny amount of R290 in a heat pump. But if you are having an R290 heat pump, there are a couple of extra criteria about where you can locate your heat pump that you need to be aware of. Firstly, you can't place it under a window. That's because the gas might come up and go through the window if it were to leak. You also can't have it next to an air brick. Now, I have an air brick just down here, but as this is an R32 heat pump, there's no problem with it being located next to an air brick. So they're just a couple of the things that you might want to consider when you're choosing the location for your heat pump. Now, another question I get asked is, does it have to physically sit next to the building? Could you put it at the bottom of your garden? Well, yes, you could, but the thing to remember is you need both a flow and a return pipe from the heat pump into your property. And you want these to be as protected as possible from the elements, because obviously you don't want the heat escaping. So you may have to consider trenching in your garden to bury these under the ground. Again, talk to your installer. If that is something that you're considering, there may be other ways that they can mitigate that. You're also going to need to get an electrical supply to the heat pump. So this particular cable here, this comes out of my attic and down to the heat pump from my consumer unit on the other side of the house. Again, you're going to need to get electrical cable to the heat pump, and if it's at the bottom of your garden and you're putting it underground, you're going to need to use something like steel wire armored cable that is specifically designed to be buried in the ground. So again, lots of things to think about, but talk to your installer about all of these, because these all need to be included in the installation plan. So the next thing to consider is radiators. Are your current radiators up to spec? Well, as part of the installation process, you should have had a heat loss survey. And as part of the heat loss survey, they will make recommendations as to whether your radiators need upgrading. Now, in our case, we had single pane radiators, nice thin ones that sit against the wall, but they just couldn't put out enough heat to warm the house to the desired level. So the vast majority of our radiators, in fact, all of our single pane radiators, with the exception of our 2 towel radiators, were all upgraded. This is a double pane radiator. There are 2 panes inside here to allow the water to flow through, giving it a much bigger surface area to let the heat radiate out into the house. Now, in one of our rooms, in the front room, we've got a triple pane radiator. So as you can see here, up against the wall, this is a triple pane radiator. And this is because this is our family room. This is where we spend most of our time, where Yogi spends most of his time lying next to the radiator. But this allows us to make sure this room is the warmest room in the house. It is the place where we spend most of our evenings in the winter, and it makes it much more comfortable. But this now has added probably an extra 15 to 20 centimeters from the original radiator. So just make sure that if you're going to be adding new radiators, that you allow for the extra depth. Now, something else you might want to consider with your radiators. If your radiators are quite old, they probably are full of gunk. By that I mean rust and particles that generally fill up in the bottom of the radiator. So they might not be performing efficiently. Now, sometimes a flush is all those radiators need to get rid of all that old gunk out of the system, and then you might suddenly find that your existing radiators are perfectly adequate. But again, it's important that you talk to your installer as part of your heat loss survey. If there is a small difference between your current radiators and what is needed, a flush might just be enough. That might be all you need. But if there is a large difference in the amount of heat that is needed, then you may need to consider updating the radiators. Now, one thing a lot of people asked was, how much redecoration did you have to do? Did you have to pull all the pipes out of the walls? Now, we have 10mm micro bore. That means that the small pipes that are behind the radiator that you generally don't see, that run up through the walls to the heating system, they are 10mm pipes. And for our Daikin heat pump, 10mm pipes were perfectly acceptable. So there was no change to any of those. We didn't have to pull any of the piping out. And the only redecoration we had to do was where they had to solder the new copper pipes around the where the hot water comes into the radiator. A tiny little bit of paint. It took me 5 minutes to touch up. Now, one thing you will notice, in fact, we'll go back out into the hall for this, is that all of my radiators have TRV valves. So you can see here we have a thermostatic control valve. These are not required, in fact, not recommended for use with heat pumps. But because of antiquated laws in the UK, the installers have to fit them. So what they recommend is you turn them all the way up to 5, you leave them open, and you let the radiator do its thing, controlled by the thermostat. So next, let's talk water tanks, because you are going to need one of these. Now, I know a lot of people, especially in more modern properties, you probably have a combi boiler, and that means you don't have a water tank. And finding space to put something this size or bigger may be a problem. So if you are upgrading from a combi boiler, you really do need to sit down with your installer and figure out where this is going to go. Now, there are solutions. If you don't have an airing cupboard, what used to be called an airing cupboard, I now call the water tank cupboard. If you don't have space for one of these, they can go in the attic. But again, you need then structural surveys to make sure that your roof can take the weight, because when this thing's full of water, it probably weighs close on a ton. If you're going to have something even bigger, because some people will need a bigger tank, then you probably need a structural survey just to make sure that your roof is sufficient to be able to take that weight. I have seen installations where the tank is laid on its side. So again, possible if you need to get it up in the roof. But there are more modern solutions. In fact, if you head across to the HeatGeek site, HeatGeek have been pioneering these small tank systems that basically can fit inside a kitchen cupboard. So again, if you have a combi boiler, it doesn't mean you can't have a heat pump because you don't have space for a tank, but just bear in mind, you probably will need to find some space to store hot water. Now, while we're talking about hot water, let's talk about water temperatures, because depending on your household, the number of people, how you enjoy, whether you have lots of baths, showers, how much hot water you need is going to dictate the size of your tank, but also the temperature of what you store your water at. Now, in this house, we don't have a bath. We have two power showers, and we absolutely love them. They are phenomenal showers, and they use a reasonable amount of water. In fact, by the time maybe myself, my wife, if we've got a couple of guests staying over, we can go through this water tank quite quickly. So again, if you've got showers that use a lot of water, talk to your installer, make sure you size the tank correctly. The other thing you might want to consider is what temperature are you going to store the water at? Now, we store the water in this tank at 43 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. I'll put it on the screen. But you might think 43 doesn't sound that high. And if you were going to sit in a bath full of warm water, you probably would want it a little bit warmer. But given we're going to mix this with a little bit of cold water for the showers when we bring it down to about 40 degrees, this is perfectly adequate. Now, if you do have a large family and you need more water, you may want to consider storing it at a higher temperature in here, then mixing it down with some cold water to the appropriate temperature. That is completely up to you, and again, talk to your installer. The other thing to consider is Legionella. So this is something that I'm actually going to be doing a whole series of tests over the next couple of weeks. So a video coming soon on, we're going to test the whole system for Legionella and how long we can leave it between cycles to make sure that we don't have any nasties growing in here. But generally, warm water, Legionella bacteria likes to grow in warm water, in shower heads, if the water temperature isn't sufficiently high to kill it. Now, 43 degrees is actually below the temperature that they recommend. So we're storing water at a temperature that is really ideal for Legionella to breed in. But every week we have a cycle kick in where we have our eddy, which is this box here. This is our solar hot water diverter. This comes on once a week in the middle of the night, boosts the tank temperature to 67 degrees. Again, 67 degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit on the screen. And then that water will sit in the system for a number of hours, making sure that any Legionella bacteria are in there are dead. Now, I think you don't need to do this every single week. So I say, I'm going to be testing this system. We're going to run a control test. We're going to run a test after 2 weeks, and we're going to run a test after 4 weeks to see if there's any Legionella growing in the system. And then we might change the cycle from weekly to maybe bi-weekly or even monthly, depending on the results of that test. But video on that coming soon. So again, if you need the water to be hotter than 43 degrees, or you need emergency hot water, you do have something in your heat pump called a booster. Now, this is just a fancy name. Really, all this is a heating element. The heating element, just like you have in your old tank, goes in there and uses electrically resistive heating to heat the water up. Now, it is nowhere near as efficient as your heat pump in heating water. With your heat pump, you're going to be getting probably between 3.5 and 4.5 coefficient of performance. That means for every unit of energy, you're going to get 3.5 to 4.5 units of heat out. With the resistive heating element, you're going to get 1 to 1. 1 kilowatt in, 1 kilowatt of heat out. The next thing to consider is noise. Now, as I say, our heat pump is about 2 meters from our boundary here. Our neighbor is approximately another 15 to 20 meters that way. So there is no chance that our neighbor is going to hear this heat pump. Now, if you were to believe everything that you read online, these things are as noisy as a jet fighter taking off on a runway. So right now, the heat pump is running. It is currently heating up hot water after our morning showers. But as you can see, while I'm talking, I'm going to bring this in close to the camera. If I continue to talk, then that's about 80 decibels. I'm not shouting. This is just the standard noise, the background noise plus me talking. If I stop talking, we get a reading of about 43 decibels. So this thing basically blends into the background. Now, you're going to get a lot of people tell you, I read in the Daily Mail, I know a man down the pub who's got a friend whose mother had a heat pump and their neighbours told them they were going to burn their house down. There's a lot of fear over the noise these things make, but they are no noisier than a gas boiler or any other appliance that you might have around your house. Now, sure, in the middle of winter, when it's -5 out here and this thing is running at full tilt, you will hear the fan running if you're stood within 1 to 2 meters of it. So be aware, when you site your heat pump, think about your neighbours. Where are your neighbours going to be? Will they be able to hear it? Are you going to give them any cause for complaint? Okay, let's talk pipe work. Now, this is something that you really want to spend a bit of time planning because, again, once this is installed, you're going to be living with this for the next 20 years. As I said, my heat pump is at the side of my house, so I'm not too worried about what this looks like. But I've seen lots of comments from people saying, that's an outrage, you running pipes up the side of your house, it looks dreadful, I wouldn't want that. And if what it looks like is more important to you than saving money, then all power to you. Personally, I prefer the money in my bank account. But you are going to need 2 big pipes. These are going to take the warm water from the heat pump up into your tank and into your radiator system, and then you're going to have your return pipe with the colder water coming back to the heat pump to be reheated. You're also going to need a drain pipe. The drain pipe is from the emergency pump. So the emergency pump is something that if there is a failure in the heating system and you've got a pressurized cylinder of hot water upstairs and you need to get that water out of the house, this is where it comes out. So you will need a pipe for that. And then we've got a couple of electrical cables. These run up the side of the house. They actually go through my attic and down the other side of the house because the electrical panel is on the other side of the house from here. But again, when you're installing it, talk to your installer about where are the pipe runs going to go. Because I've seen pipe runs that come up, then they sort of go horizontally across the house and then go up again. They look really ugly. This isn't the prettiest pipe work, but it is at least a straight line from here straight up and into the attic where it can then go into the hot water tank. Modern installations that I've seen that Octopus do, they do offer a boxing for these pipes. So it's like a plastic cover that goes around the whole thing. So it's all in one box, but there's no getting away from the fact you are going to need pipe work. Okay, I promised you a bonus topic, and that's to think about your electrical supply. As I say, we have cables that run from here on one side of our house up and through the attic to the other side of the house to the consumer unit. Now, it's not a problem here because we have a 100 amp single phase supply, which means we've got plenty of capacity to run this from our electrical supply. But it's worth checking in your fuse box where your incoming supply comes in, what your main incoming fuse is. If you're on a 60 amp fuse, that might be an indication that you have something called a looped supply. That means that the cable comes in, probably goes to your neighbor, comes out of your neighbor, and then comes to you. If you have a looped supply, your installer will probably not want to install a heat pump. What you need to do is contact the DNO, that's your regional electricity supplier, the people that are responsible for your electricity meter, and ask to be unlooped. Now, they shouldn't charge you for this. Now, depending on the capacity in the area, you might get either an unlooped 80 or 100 amp supply. I've heard lots of rumors recently that they're starting to put in 80 as the standard. I would ask for a 100 amp supply. Give yourself that capacity later on should you need it. But consider where your cabling is going to go. And again, remember, it's your house. You have to live with it. Now, your installer might choose what is the cheapest route to get the cable from where it comes into the house to where it's needed. You might have different ideas. You might say, well, actually, I don't want it going all the way up my house and through the loft and down the other side. I prefer it to go a different way. Remember, it's your house. You tell them exactly what you want. Anyway, I hope this video has been useful. If you are considering getting a heat pump, then please do consider using my Octopus referral code. That referral code will get you £100 off of your heat pump, and the £100 that I get, I'm going to give to good causes. We're going to be giving away all of the money we make from this YouTube channel over this whole year and trying to lift as many people as we can out of energy debt. So your £100 will go towards that. With that, it just remains for me to say thank you for clicking on this video. I hope you found it informative. And if you do have any questions, then please do hit me up in the comments. I'd love to talk. With that, I'm going to sign off. And if I'm lucky, I'll see you back here real soon for another video. Take care. Bye-bye.